This video is intended to introduce a series that may seem to constitute a fairly significant departure from my typical content. After all, what business does a Christian apologetics and theology channel have doing a deep dive into the Crusades? Well, as it happens, in addition to my interests in analytic philosophy, systematic theology, and biblical studies, I also have a long-standing interest in military history, and especially in medieval military history. And while this interest may seem unrelated to the others, I have found that there are often interesting connections between them. These connections arise most vividly in the context of the Crusades. The reason for this is that a subversive modern narrative about the Crusades has been used by critics of Christianity, most notably by new atheist and Muslim apologists, to argue that Christianity, or religion more generally, is a violent and dangerous thing. This modern narrative goes something like this. The barbaric and greedy Europeans viciously invaded the Holy Land for the purpose of plundering the wealth of the peaceful and more civilized Muslims, and with the intent of forcibly converting them to Christianity. This series of invasions was, moreover, unprovoked and was ultimately an abysmal failure, forever staining Christianity's reputation. As we shall see throughout this series, this popular narrative has very little basis in history. The truth of the matter is much more complex, and it is historically quite plausible that the Crusades actually brought about numerous positive results that still benefit us today. But perhaps there is some question regarding why a Protestant Christian like myself cares about this issue at all. If the Crusades were so bad, surely that is only a blight on the reputation of the Roman Catholic Church, right? Surely we can challenge the inference from the misdeeds of some Christian sects to the culpability of all Christian sects. I think that this general line of reasoning is right as far as it goes. And prior to my own interest in the Crusades, this was my first line of defense against critics. However, the popular narrative about the Crusades has been deployed more widely than just as an argument against Christianity. It has become part and parcel of a larger contemporary assault on Western culture, springing from the felt need to demonize the West and to constantly portray Westerners as oppressive barbaric colonizers who have always pillaged and destroyed the cultures of their more enlightened, advanced, tolerant, and refined neighbors. As Efraim Karsh summarizes, to many educated Westerners, empire and imperialism are categories that apply exclusively to the European powers and, more recently, to the United States. In this view of things, Muslims, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, are merely objects, the long-suffering victims of the aggressive encroachments of others. Lacking an internal autonomous dynamic of its own, their history is rather a function of their unhappy interaction with the West, whose obligation is to make amends. Some date this interaction back to the Crusades. Now, I happen to like Western culture, and that motivates me to oppose those who campaign against it, especially when these campaigns are predicated upon an overly simplistic or patently false historical narrative. For that reason, I believe that it is well worth the time to reopen the history books and return to the often maligned, but seldom understood, time of the Crusades. The purpose of this series is not to whitewash the history or to pretend that none of the Crusaders ever did anything wrong. Above all, this series is intended to inform viewers about the actual history of what transpired during the Crusades. Certain actions on the part of certain Crusaders definitely deserve criticism, and I do not intend to hide these episodes from viewers. At the same time, the opponents of the Crusaders typically engaged in comparable atrocities, and typically far more often than their Crusader counterparts. This side of the story is absolutely essential to understanding the actions and reactions of the Crusaders, since it contextualizes their activities and renders them more understandable. One final note regarding the sources that I will be citing is in order. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I am in the habit of locating the most scholarly sources that I can possibly find when I critique positions other than my own. I do this for the express purpose of mitigating my own bias and presenting the opposing side of any given debate in the strongest possible light to assure viewers that I am not overstating my case or misrepresenting the opposition. For that reason, it may seem strange to viewers of this series that I have, for the most part, chosen popularizers and non-experts as my interlocutors. The reason for this, as we shall see, is that historians who specialize in the Crusades tend to view them far more sympathetically than those who vehemently speak out against them. Experts in the field, in other words, tend to agree with the conclusions that I will be defending throughout this series. My selection of popular authors as foils, then, is not the result of ignoring scholarship that is critical of my position. Rather, it is a byproduct of the fact that scholarship on the Crusades largely shares the perspective that this series will defend. Christopher Tyerman, himself one of today's greatest scholars of the Crusades, laments the inundation of the popular sphere with so much misinformation, saying, "Yet no aspect of Christian medieval history enjoys clearer modern recognition than the Crusades, nor has been more subject to egregious distortion. Most of what passes in public as knowledge of the Crusades is either misleading or false. The Crusades were not solely wars against Islam in Palestine. They were not chiefly conducted by land-hungry younger sons, nor were they part of some early attempt to impose Western economic hegemony on the world. More fundamentally, they did not represent an aberration from Christian teaching." Steve Weidenkopf reiterates this sentiment, saying, "The Crusades are among the most misused and, by far, the most misunderstood endeavors in all church history. In the minds of most modern people, the very word crusade conjures negative images of bloodthirsty, barbaric, and greedy European nobles setting out to conquer peaceful Muslims living in the Holy Land. These images are reinforced by the media, both in print and film. It is extremely frustrating for serious scholars of the Crusades to witness these events thoroughly maligned and misrepresented in the media." The Crusades are overwhelmingly viewed negatively in popular culture. They tend to be seen as prime examples of a worst-case scenario for where religious extremism might lead. It's not difficult to prove this. One need only crack open most popular level works on the subject to find quotations like the following. Karen Armstrong writes, "The Crusades were not a fringe movement in the Middle Ages. They were central to the new Western identity that was forged at this time and which persists to the present day. The Crusades also show religion at its very worst." Similarly, Tim Unwin says, "Religion not only legitimated these violent, arduous, and expensive conflicts, but more importantly, it also initiated them." Likewise, Jack David Eller claims, "What transpired was a series of waves of religiously inspired, less than coordinated, and not always noble invasions of the East." Ergun and Emir are even harsher, saying, "The call for the First Crusade is arguably the darkest day in Christian history, the day that Christianity declared a Jihad. The terrifying consequences of that dismal day were so harrowing that the effects still resonate throughout the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. Christianity has never recovered from the darkness of that decision." This video is merely intended as an appetizer for what is to come in the subsequent installments of this series. As such, we will be focusing on rebutting several popular myths about the Crusades cataloged in the aforementioned citations so as to clear a path for understanding the Crusades properly. The 5 myths that we will examine in this video include the following. 1. The Crusades were unprovoked invasions of the East. 2. The Crusades involved forcibly converting people to Christianity. 3. The Crusaders were greedy proto-colonists. 4. The Crusades are the cause of the present conflict in the Middle East. 5. The Crusades were fundamentally unchristian. Perhaps the most widespread myth regarding the Crusades is the idea that they were unprovoked wars of aggression by intolerant Europeans. Karen Armstrong is a proponent of this myth, writing, "Before the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem in July 1099 and savagely butchered some 40,000 of its Jewish and Muslim inhabitants, Jews, Christians, and Muslims had lived together there under Islamic rule and relative harmony for 460 years, almost half a millennium." Kaner and Kaner are guilty of propagating this idea that the Muslims were blameless as well when they say, Urban had succeeded in rallying the warriors to battle. In so doing, he forever blurred the distinction Augustine of Hippo had drawn between an aggressive war and a defensive battle. Instead of justice, the Roman Church sought a conquest. But this narrative is, to use a colorful term, poppycock. The First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II in 1095 as a direct response to a petition from the Byzantine Emperor asking for help in holding back Muslim invasions into his empire. The First Crusade, then, was a reaction to Islamic aggression, and it was not just a reaction to the immediate invasions of the Byzantine Empire. By the time of the First Crusade, Islam had spread by the sword from being a little backwater Arabian cult to controlling vast swaths of the Middle East, North Africa, portions of southern Europe, and most of Spain. The Muslims, therefore, set the stage for a showdown between the Muslim East and the Christian West by aggressively encroaching into Western territory and thereby provoking a military response. As Paul Crawford puts it, within a scant 120 years from initial Muslim attacks, Islamic forces had taken control of lands from the Hindu Kush Mountains to the Atlantic coast, ripping away control of some 2/3 or more of the Christian world. In the following centuries, they launched continual attacks on Christian territory, forcing the House of Islam even farther into Christian lands. In 1095, after centuries of attack and a few tentative responses of their own, Western Europeans were finally ready to mount a major counteroffensive. A counteroffensive, not an initiation of hostilities, and certainly very far from the first major clash between Islam and Christianity. It was merely the latest phase in the long-running conflict between the two faiths that had begun with the Muslim conquest of Christian Syria in 633. There had been nearly continual conflict between the two from then on, with the Christians giving ground with disastrous swiftness, and only later mounting counterattacks to recover their lost territories as it became possible. The Crusades were not the beginning of these counterattacks. The earliest genuinely successful ones were undertaken by the Byzantines in the 9th century in an effort to recover historic Christian lands, though there were significant successful efforts in the lands of the Franks, Italians, and Spaniards as well. The Crusades were merely another aspect of the conflict that had existed between Islam and Christianity, and Islam and Judaism, since Islam's inception. As the First Crusade began, a new chapter was indeed being written, but in a book that was already very old. Nor was this dynamic of Western Crusades as a response to Muslim aggression limited to the First Crusade alone. The ill-fated Second Crusade was likewise a response to the fall of the county of Edessa to the Muslim ruler Zengi in 1144. Similarly, the famous Third Crusade was a response to the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187. The Fourth and Fifth Crusades, at least theoretically, also shared this purpose. The Reconquista in Spain was likewise a war to recapture Spain from the Muslims. And while they are much more controversial, as we will see in subsequent videos, the later Crusades in Europe were likewise motivated by people groups whose military activities provided an existential threat to the Catholic West. In virtually all cases, the Crusades were reactionary wars and were, therefore, not unprovoked, as the popular narrative claims. Crusade scholar Thomas Madden summarizes this perfectly, saying, "Far from being an offensive attack on the lands of Islam, Western Christians saw the Crusades as defensive reactions to Muslim aggression. From the time of Muhammad, the Muslim state had expanded by the sword. Traditional Muslim thought divided the world into two spheres, the abode of Islam and the abode of war. Christianity, and for that matter, any other non-Muslim religion, has no abode. Christians and Jews can be tolerated within a Muslim state under Muslim rule, but their states must be destroyed and they must be conquered. The Christian world, therefore, was a prime target for the earliest caliphs, and it would remain so for Muslim leaders for the next 1,000 years. With enormous energy, the warriors of Islam struck out against the Christians shortly after Muhammad's death in 632. They were extremely successful. Palestine, Syria, Egypt, the most heavily Christian areas in the world, quickly succumbed. By the 8th century, Muslim armies had conquered all of Christian North Africa and Spain. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks conquered Asia Minor, modern Turkey, which had been Christian since the days of St. Paul. That is what gave birth to the Crusades. They were a response to more than 4 centuries of conquest in which Muslim armies had already captured 2/3 of the old Christian world. At some point, Christianity as a faith and a culture either defended itself or was subsumed by Islam. The Crusades were that defense. Furthermore, as we shall see in a future video, the persecutions that the Muslims perpetrated against their Christian subjects within the lands that they occupied were considerable. In fact, this was one of the primary reasons cited by Pope Urban for calling a crusade in the first place. The Knights of Europe were being sent to relieve their brothers and sisters in the East from the tyrannical rule of the Muslims. As Thomas Madden observes, crusading was seen as an act of love, in this case, the love of one's neighbor. The crusade was seen as an errand of mercy to right a terrible wrong. As the Pope wrote to the Knights Templar, "You carry out in deeds the words of the gospel. Greater love than this hath no man, that he lay down his life for his friends." Steve Weidenkopf adds, "Faith and love of God, neighbor, and self were the main reasons why medieval people participated in the Crusades. This is clear from the written evidence contained in the charters of the time, which were documents recording property transactions. Popes, preachers, and saints throughout the crusading movement focused their exhortations on the recognition that service in God's army arose from love of God, love of neighbor, and concern for one's salvation. Hence, for 2 major reasons, it is false to say that the Crusades were unprovoked. First, it is false because the Crusades were a reactionary movement to 400 years of aggressive Islamic expansion into Christian territory. Second, it is false because the Muslims severely mistreated the Christian populations living under their control. Both of these factors provoked the Crusades. Perhaps the most insidious bit of misinformation regarding the Crusades is the idea that they involved forcibly converting Muslims or other non-Christians to Christianity at sword point. This idea has become so widespread that it is just taken as a given by many contemporary critics of the Crusades. A cursory look at some popular literature bears this out. Emma Johnson, for example, claims forced conversion has been a recurring feature of religious expansion throughout history. It involves the use of coercion, violence, or other forms of pressure to compel individuals or groups to adopt a particular religious belief. During the Crusades, forced conversions of Muslims and Jews occurred in conquered territories. Similarly, David Kling asserts that the 11th to 15th centuries witnessed the persecution of Jews and heretics, crusades against Muslims, and the increasing acceptance of forced conversions. David Lantigua argues along the same lines, saying, "Nothing in the Middle Ages shaped Christian-infidel relations more than the Papal Crusades and Holy War. Holy War's growing popularity vitiated Christian-infidel relations by corrupting the peaceful ethic of evangelization taught by Jesus, the apostles, and the early church. The violent excesses of the First Crusade were a major turning point. Marauding bands of armed pilgrims who decimated certain Jewish and Muslim communities from Germany to Egypt represented egregious examples of forced baptism under a policy of conversion or death." And Kaner and Kaner add, "Certainly the papal forces sometimes sought to convert the heathen, but their methods were flawed. They sought to force conversion by the sword, in a type of Christian Jihad. As logic dictates that forced conversion is no conversion at all, one is perplexed by the tragically misguided and brutally vicious crusaders." As popular as the idea of Europeans forcing Muslims to convert to Christianity may be, there is one major problem with this narrative. It never happened. Or, at least, any incidents where it did were overwhelmingly isolated, irregular, and discouraged by canon law. It was most assuredly not the purpose of any of the Crusades in the Holy Land to convert the Muslims to Christianity. As Jonathan Riley Smith points out, forcible conversions were, of course, directly contrary to the injunctions of canon law, about which educated churchmen were in no doubt. For centuries, the principle had been repeatedly enunciated that infidels, and particularly Jews, should never be forced to the faith, but could only be persuaded by reason. The Crusades, at least initially, had nothing to do with converting people to Christianity. Muslims were overwhelmingly viewed as enemies, not potential converts. There were many reasons why Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095. He wanted to answer Byzantium's call for help. He wanted to roll back the threat of Islamic expansion into Europe. He wanted to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. He wanted to liberate Christians suffering under the iron fist of their Muslim overlords. He wanted to recapture the places where Jesus had lived for Christianity, and he wanted to exert his authority over the knights of Catholic Europe. There is abundant evidence to support that all of these were major catalysts for launching the First Crusade. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that evangelism was ever part of the vision. As Steve Weidenkopf puts it, despite the belief of modern-day critics, the Crusades were not wars of conversion comparable to those that had helped Islam spread by the sword. Indeed, engaging in warfare simply for the conversion of others was never a criterion for just war, nor does the historical record indicate that this is what motivated the Crusaders. Now, more careful critics of the Crusades are well aware that the Crusades in the Holy Land never involved evangelistic aims. However, they will be swift to point out that the practically unknown Northern Crusades in northeastern Europe did indeed come to include an evangelistic component. Converting the pagans was one of the principal goals of these military campaigns. The Muslim apologist Javad Hashmi makes precisely this point, saying,
outside of Europe, Christendom kept expanding, and they used their interpretation of the Bible. That was their interpretation of the New Testament, the belief of the emperor as God's rod on earth, and their Old Testament interpretation and their own conception of Christendom as the new Israel. And so they had a doctrine of the equivalent of perpetual warfare that we'll look at. And so they waged hundreds of years of warfare of the Northern Crusades. So he's going to argue that the Crusades were just defensive. These are the Northern Crusades waged for hundreds of years against the pagans to forcibly convert them.
And while critics like Hashmi are correct that there was an evangelistic component included within the Northern Crusades, it is really misleading for them to simply state this without explaining what this actually looked like in practice. Because of the aforementioned myth regarding the Crusaders converting Muslims to Christianity at sword point, unqualified statements like Hashmi's give popular audiences the impression that the Northern Crusades involved giving Baltic pagans the choice to convert or die, but nothing could be further from the truth. The evangelistic efforts of the Northern Crusades were explicitly not to be carried out by military campaigns. Rather, the military campaigns were seen as making evangelism possible, and thereby contributing to evangelism only indirectly. The actual act of evangelism was to be carried out by Christian missionaries, not Crusader knights. As William Urban, perhaps the foremost historian of the Northern Crusades in the English-speaking world, puts it, according to canon law, a holy war was a last resort, and even then, it was but an indirect means of Christianization. The Crusaders were to avoid the physical destruction of the pagans because their immortal souls would surely be lost, and the destruction of their property and rights was to be avoided lest that hinder the missionaries in overcoming their hatred and distrust. The object of a crusade was not to compel the unbelievers to crowd into a baptismal font at the point of a sword. Only uneducated fanatics would do that, but to make it possible for missionaries to persuade by example and the word of God. The Crusaders were permitted only to prevent anyone from hindering the priests from preaching to unbelievers. And elsewhere he writes, the role of the Christian knight was not to spread the gospel, but to protect those who had the calling and training to do so. We will explore this matter in greater detail later on in this series, but for now, I hope it is clear that the Crusades in the Holy Land had nothing to do with forcibly converting people to Christianity, and even the later Crusades, which did include evangelistic efforts, were far more nuanced than simply telling pagans to convert or die. A further myth propagated by many popular writers regarding the Crusades pertains to the idea that the Crusaders were motivated by a proto-colonial, proto-white supremacist imperialist ideology, and were, moreover, also motivated primarily by greed. The idea that the Crusaders primarily consisted of the second sons of great lords, who would not receive an inheritance, and so decided to gain lands in the Middle East instead, has almost become orthodoxy among popularizers. Again, Karen Armstrong shows herself to be reliably unreliable, saying, nearly 1,000 years ago, when Europe was still a barbarous and uncivilized place, thousands of Christians had struggled all the way to the Middle East and established states and kingdoms there. They were our first colonies. Joshua Prawer likewise asserts that the Crusades are the opening chapter of European expansion and foreshadow all later colonial movements. Similarly, Antonio Santasuoso writes, the lure of riches for many knights economically disadvantaged in their own lands was another siren calling them eastward. Brian Catlouse describes the Crusaders' motivations in similar terms, suggesting, in fact, the knights and nobility answered Urban's call to the east only because so many were already heading in that direction in search of fortune and glory. Michael Jerryson likewise adds, while many who chose to join this pilgrimage of faith did so for the best of intentions, various European nobles saw opportunities for increasing their economic coffers. So the first point to raise when assessing the motivations of the Crusaders regards being wary of the fallacy of presentism. Presentism is defined as uncritical adherence to present-day attitudes and or the tendency to interpret past events in terms of modern values and concepts. We must be very careful about assuming that medieval people were just like us and acted for the same sorts of reasons that are familiar to us. Alfred Andrea reminds us, the notion that medieval people, or people of any long past era or alien culture, were just like us and acted out of motives very much like our own and within the context of a mindset, worldview, and set of ethical standards that we share, has led to some basic misunderstandings of the Crusades and the people involved in them. This misguided equivalency has tempted many to offer moral judgments based on a set of assumptions that have little or no historical validity. In the case of the Crusades, it has led to a failure to understand medieval Christian and Islamic belief systems on their own terms. It has also resulted in an inability to understand the values and perspectives of medieval authors and the genres in which they were writing. Similarly, Christopher Tyerman wisely says, there can be no summoning of the past to take sides in the present. Plundering history to deliver modern indictments serves no rational or benign purpose. To observe the past through the lens of the present invites delusion. So too does ignoring the existence of that lens. However, the burden of understanding lies on us to appreciate the world of the past, not on the past to provide ours with facile precedents or good stories, although of the latter, the Crusades supply plenty. Failure to appreciate these points has led many modern authors, like those mentioned before, to be predisposed towards more cynical or earthly motivations for the Crusaders. In an increasingly secular age, it's often hard for us to truly understand how deeply real the spiritual world felt to people of that time. It can be hard for those of us living in a secular age to imagine people acting on the basis of purely religious or spiritual reasons without having an underlying self-serving motivation. And unfortunately, this causes many to view the Crusades in an anachronistic fashion. Such is the case when attempts are made to compare the Crusades to colonialism. This comparison springs from a basic failure to understand that colonialism is a 16th to 19th century idea born out of a conjunction of both Enlightenment ideology and nationalism. Both of these were utterly alien to those living at the time of the Crusades. Nations, in the modern sense, did not even exist at the time of the First Crusade, let alone the concept of nationalism. Europe was divided among loose coalitions of petty lordships, nothing like the strong monarchies that emerged later on. The Crusades could not have been colonial efforts, that is, nationalistic efforts, for the simple reason that nationalism was an idea that had not yet been conceived of at that time. Thomas Madden explains, it is important to remember that in the Middle Ages, the West was not a powerful dominant culture venturing into a primitive or backward region. It was the Muslim East that was powerful, wealthy, and opulent. Europe was the Third World. The Crusader states, founded in the wake of the First Crusade, were not new plantations of Catholics in a Muslim world akin to the British colonization of America. Catholic presence in the Crusader states was always tiny, easily less than 10% of the population. These were the rulers and magistrates, as well as Italian merchants and members of the military orders. The overwhelming majority of the population in the Crusader states was Muslim. They were not colonies, therefore, in the sense of plantations or even factories, as in the case of India. These were outposts. The ultimate purpose of the Crusader states was to defend the holy places in Palestine, especially Jerusalem, and to provide a safe environment for Christian pilgrims to visit those places. There was no mother country with which the Crusader states had an economic relationship, nor did Europeans economically benefit from them. Quite the contrary, the expense of crusades to maintain the Latin East was a serious drain on European resources. And Corliss Slack adds, today, the considered judgment of most historians who study the chronicles, letters, songs, charters, and artworks of every sort from the Crusade period is that the Christian spirituality and religious fervor of the Middle Ages, rather than elements evident in European colonialism of the 19th and 20th centuries, was the dominant factor in a complex mix of motives for crusading. In fact, the conflicts between Christians and Muslims prior to the Crusades proceeded very much like any other conflict between political and religious powers of the day. As Thomas Asbridge points out, there may, at times, have been little love lost between Christian and Muslim neighbors, but there was, in truth, little to distinguish this enmity from the endemic political and military struggles of the age. Where Christians and Muslims did face each other across the centuries, their relationship had been unremarkable, characterized like that between any potential rivals by periods of conflict and others of coexistence. There is little or no evidence to suggest that either side harbored any innate empowering religious or racial hatred of the other. One final difficulty for the idea that the Crusaders were akin to European colonists of centuries later regards the fact that once they had completed their pilgrimage, most surviving Crusaders simply returned back home to Europe. Slack makes this point forcefully, saying, a final and compelling reason to conclude that the vast majority of persons who left on the First Crusade had no intention whatsoever of colonizing eastern lands is that most of the surviving veterans, their pilgrimage to the Holy City completed, returned to their homes in the West shortly after the capture of Jerusalem in July 1099, leaving a small minority of Westerners to govern the vast majority of Muslims and Eastern Christians. With all this in mind, we are now better equipped to assess the original question regarding what motivated the Crusaders to leave their homes, to partake in a very long and arduous journey, and to put themselves in mortal danger. It is important to highlight from the outset that the Crusaders were a diverse group, and we should not assume that they all had exactly the same motivations. Furthermore, it is worth remembering that religious motivations and selfish motivations are not necessarily incompatible. As William Urban reminds us, motives for taking the cross were diverse, and more often than not, secular motives were mixed in with idealism and religious enthusiasm. But with those qualifications in place, we can speak in general terms of overarching motivations for the vast majority of those who went on crusade. One of the most important books on this subject, written in contemporary crusade scholarship, is a volume entitled The First Crusade and the Idea of Crusading by Jonathan Riley Smith. It is safe to say that this book has proven hugely influential in creating a new consensus among historians specializing in the Crusades. Riley Smith brought to light previously neglected evidence which forever discredits the idea that the Crusaders were predominantly landless second sons who were just motivated by greed. One category of previously ignored evidence comes from the charters of the First Crusaders. These are the legal documents which were written up as they settled their affairs at home before participating in the crusade, and they give us a window into the thoroughly selfless motivations most of the Crusaders had. They frequently settled debts and disputes to their own financial disadvantage in order to participate in the crusade. Riley Smith summarizes just a few examples of this, saying, Bernard of Moncontour had retained in his possession 2/3 of the property with which his father had endowed Trinity of Vendôme. Now he gave it up in return for 18,000 solidi, but also because he believed that the way of God, the crusade, could in no way benefit him while he held these proceeds of theft. Similarly, Hugh Bouchard renounced his usurpation of a peasant's holding, which belonged to St. Philbert of Tournos, in return for £4 and a mule, and because he feared punishment for this sin and wished to go to Jerusalem. 3 knights of the castle of Mazenc, Peter Bescardius, Pons, and Bertrand, had been extremely violent and oppressive towards villagers of the abbey of Saint Chaffre of Le Montistier. They renounced their depredations in return for cash, and also because they had vowed to join the crusade. The evidence of the charters suggests, therefore, that the response of the knights to Urban's call was idealistic. But the evidence of the charters is just the tip of the iceberg. Riley Smith also shows that it was almost a pun in songs from the era that one virtually had to bankrupt themselves to go on crusade. He goes on for pages documenting the legal records which indicate the unfavorable ways in which crusaders had to mortgage their properties and borrow funds from their families to the point of bankruptcy just to raise the funds necessary to join the crusade. He summarizes his findings as follows. The picture that emerges, however, is one of relatives making substantial sacrifices to provide cash for crusaders. There really is no evidence to support the proposition that the crusade was an opportunity for spare sons to make themselves scarce in order to relieve their families of burdens. The evidence points, in fact, to families taking on burdens to help individual members fulfill their vows. In light of the evidence, it is hard to believe that most crusaders were motivated by crude materialism. Given their knowledge and expectations, and the economic climate in which they lived, the disposal of assets to invest in the fairly remote possibility of settlement in the East would have been a stupid gamble. It makes much more sense to suppose, insofar as one can generalize about them, that they were moved by an idealism which must have inspired not only them, but also their families. It is fair to say that Riley Smith's work has completely reshaped contemporary Crusade scholarship. While there may be occasional examples of people who participated in the Crusades in the hopes of personal gain, the evidence overwhelmingly indicates that this was not generally the case, which is why almost no contemporary expert in the Crusades defends the landless second sons theory anymore. To illustrate that Riley Smith's conclusion is by far the dominant view among experts in the Crusades, I will quote several leading scholars making the same point. Thomas Madden writes, "What is clearest in the documentary record is that the vast majority of the knightly crusaders were not spare sons, but instead the lords of their estates. It was not those with the least to lose who took up the cross, but rather those with the most. Such men knew well the dangers of the proposed journey of some 2,000 miles. The cost of crusading was truly enormous. The knight who planned to bring a few family members, as many did, and an army appropriate to his position and authority, would need to assemble funds equal to 5 or 6 times his annual income. Few had that sort of money lying around. They were forced to sell freeholds or settle property disputes to their disadvantage to raise the funds. In many cases, they also turned to their relatives, who liquidated their own assets to support the crusade. All of this represents a significant, in many cases dangerous, drain on the resources of a crusading knight and his family. The tears that flowed when a crusader left his wife were not the result solely of an expected long absence, but also of the strong likelihood that the soldier would never return. To understand why thousands of knights and their families made such profound sacrifices, one must remember that they were medieval, not modern people. Elsewhere, he says, scholars have discovered that crusading knights were generally wealthy men with plenty of their own land in Europe. Nevertheless, they spent enormous sums to undertake their mission. Crusading was not cheap. Even wealthy lords could easily impoverish themselves and their families by joining a crusade. They did so not merely for material wealth, which they already had, but because they hoped to store up treasure where rust and moth could not corrupt. Of course, they were not opposed to capturing booty if it could be had, but the truth is that the Crusades were notoriously bad for plunder. A few people got rich, but the vast majority returned with nothing. Indeed, many did not return at all. Approximately 1 out of 2 crusaders died on the journey. Thomas Asbridge echoes this sentiment, saying, "The reality was that most crusaders were inspired by a complex combination of motives. Many must have harbored hopes that in the course of this devotional pilgrimage they might reap some personal gain. But perhaps the most significant insight into the medieval mentality offered by the First Crusade is the unequivocal demonstration that authentic Christian devotion and a heartfelt desire for material wealth were not mutually exclusive impulses in the 11th century. We now know that greed cannot have been the dominant motive among the First Crusaders, not least because, as recent research has shown, for most participants, the expedition promised to be utterly terrifying and cripplingly expensive." He goes on to conclude, "When juxtaposed with this rich mosaic of evidence for pious motivation, the once fashionable myth that the Crusaders were self-serving, disinherited land-hungry younger sons must be discarded. Crusading was indeed an activity that could bring spiritual and material rewards, but it was, in the first instance, both intimidating and extremely costly. Devotion inspired Europe to crusade, and on the road to Jerusalem, the first Crusaders proved time and again that their most powerful weapon was a shared sense of purpose and an indestructible spiritual resolution." Steve Weidenkopf likewise says, "The huge response to Urban's call at the Council of Clermont is even more amazing when considering the cost to go on crusade. For a knight, 4 to 5 times his annual income. Although some modern critics assert that the Crusaders were focused on the accumulation of wealth, the historical record shows that the vast majority of those who took the cross suffered financial hardship as a result. They certainly did not profit from it. In order to finance such an expensive undertaking, many knights and their extended family sold or mortgaged their land and possessions." And he goes on to note, "Faith is certainly a more reasonable explanation than material gain. If material reasons had been paramount, would it not have been far easier and safer for Western warriors to stay home and fight their neighbors rather than travel 2,500 miles to a distant and completely alien land? The evidence is quite simply overwhelming that the once popular narrative that the Crusaders were European colonists motivated by greed must be discarded. The excellent work of historians, notably Jonathan Riley Smith, has thoroughly discredited this idea. This is not, of course, to say that one cannot find isolated examples of crusaders with more nefarious motivations, but it is to insist that for the vast majority of crusaders, their intentions were both noble and sincerely religious.
I go to pray.
For what?
For the strength to endure what is to come.
And what is to come?
The reckoning is to come for what was done 100 years before. The Muslims will never forget. Nor should they.
It is just taken as a given by many modern commentators that the contemporary unrest in the Middle East has its roots in the Crusades. The idea is that the Crusaders are directly responsible for the modern hostility that many Muslims have towards the West today. The atrocities allegedly perpetrated by the Crusaders against the Muslims are supposed to be so profound that the memory of them lives on vividly in the minds of Muslims today. Probably to no one's surprise at this point, Karen Armstrong is a proponent of this idea, claiming that the Crusades were one of the direct causes of the conflict in the Middle East today. In his influential book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, Amin Maalouf asserts that there can be no doubt that the schism between these two worlds dates from the Crusades, deeply felt by the Arabs, even today, as an act of rape. In a similar vein, John Esposito claims, for Muslims, the memory of the Crusades lives on as the clearest example of militant Christianity, an earlier harbinger for the aggression and imperialism of the Christian West, a vivid reminder of Christianity's early hostility towards Islam. If many regard Islam as a religion of the sword, Muslims down through the ages have spoken of the West's crusader mentality and ambition. Likewise, we find John Trumbore suggesting that the Crusades left a lasting impression on the Muslim world. The brutality of their campaigns, particularly in comparison with the noble reputation of Saladin, continues to color Muslim perceptions of the Christian West. Probably the most notable proponent of this idea has been the ex-president of the United States, Bill Clinton. In a now infamous speech following the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, Clinton suggested that the Crusaders actually bore responsibility for this occurrence. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. As we shall see, the Crusaders were initially seen by Muslims as just being one further faction within a complex web of powers and alliances that were all vying for control of these particular regions. After the eventual fall of Acre in 1291, the Crusades were basically forgotten by the Muslim world altogether, and only recently, in the last 100 years or so, have the Crusades been remembered by Muslims because the memory of them serves their political and ideological agendas. Moreover, this recent memory of them bears very little resemblance to the actual history, and is perhaps better characterized as a distortion of history, or, more accurately still, as propaganda, than as a long-lasting memory of the events themselves. To establish this, we begin by looking at the earliest Muslim sources. When one reads these sources, it is clear that their interest in the Crusaders is restricted to their skirmishes and interactions with them, just as with any other enemy with which they interacted. There is no sense of the Crusaders providing a unique existential threat or exercising a unique level of militant brutality. The Muslim sources obviously demonize the Crusaders as infidels, but they do this for all rivals of other faiths. The salient point is just that one doesn't get the feeling that Muslims viewed the Crusaders significantly differently than they did rival Muslim factions or the Byzantines. Indeed, the Crusaders are often just seen as a mercenary army for the Byzantines, not a new threat. Mona Hamad and Edward Peters explain, Muslim observers did not originally regard the Crusaders as something separate and distinct from other conflicts with the Franks, nor did they initially single out the Crusaders from the long series of infidel enemies whom they fought from time to time. The chroniclers report in detail the smallest skirmishes between Muslims and Frankish troops, but they have little to say about the internal affairs of the Frankish states in the Levant, and even less about their lands in Western Europe. Many authors initially regarded the invasion of the Franks merely as a variant of the recurrent Byzantine assaults. Most 12th and 13th century Arab authors do not show particular hatred or animosity, religious or otherwise, towards the Crusaders, although hostile epithets are often used conventionally after mentioning the Franks. In any case, the memory of the Crusades paled before the disaster of the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. The immense destruction they caused, their sacking of Baghdad in 1258, and their defeat in 1260 by the Turkish Mamluks of Egypt, far outshone the Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem and the Mamluk capture of Acre in 1291. Efraim Karsh adds, only a century earlier, the Byzantines had temporarily regained substantial parts of the Levant as far south as Galilee, and the Crusades appeared to be a repetition of this. So much so that an Iraqi poet lamenting the fall of Jerusalem in July 1099, more than 2 years after the arrival of the Crusaders in the Levant, substituted the Byzantines for the Franks as the city's conquerors, while the oral histories of the Anatolian Turks contained hardly a trace of the crossing of the Frankish armies. There was no general fear of impending doom to Islam's collective existence, and the Muslim dynasts and potentates viewed the Crusaders in purely localized terms. As far as they were concerned, the Franks were not representatives of a hostile civilization that had to be fought to the death, but a new factor in the existing network of local feuds and rivalries that had to be utilized to one's own advantage. So this idea that the Crusaders, through their brutality, left some sort of deep, long-lasting memory of the hostility of the West upon the Muslim world is simply not reflected in the primary Muslim sources of the time. The Muslim interest in the Crusaders is fairly minimal, only arising in connection with the episodes in which the two peoples came into contact, just like any other local enemy. Rather than the Crusaders, it was actually the Mongols who the Muslims regarded as an existential threat, and who left the more lasting impression. When one examines the geopolitical situation of Palestine at this time, it's not actually all that surprising that the Crusades did not leave a lasting impression. This was a part of the world that was already constantly ravaged by persistent wars between Muslims and the Byzantines, and even by wars between rival Muslim factions. The Crusaders were largely seen as just another player in this ongoing battle for the Holy Land. Again, Karsh correctly notes, the limited scale of the Crusades, which affected only a fraction of the Middle East, paradoxically exacerbated Muslim fragmentation and disunity. The invasions were virtually confined to Palestine and parts of Syria, and even at their height, meant little or nothing to Iraq and the Caliphate, let alone to Iran, Central Asia, or even Upper Egypt. The political evolution of these lands was hardly influenced by the Crusades, with whom their inhabitants had no contact whatever. As a result, the Crusades were seen not as a cataclysmic event, but as yet another round in the intermittent fighting that had been raging between the Byzantine and the Islamic empires for centuries. After the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land fell in 1291, the Crusaders quickly faded from the collective Muslim memory. Until very modern times, the only memories to be found of the Crusades within the Islamic world could be found in triumphalist storytelling of the local Hakawati, or professional orators. Expected to entertain people through storytelling, the Hakawati would occasionally tell stories about the Crusades, but these were generally limited to events taking place locally and bore little resemblance to the history anyway, inasmuch as their primary purpose was to entertain. There is an illustrative episode from 1898 when the German Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Damascus. The Kaiser wished to pay his respects to the great Muslim Sultan Saladin, who was buried there, by placing a wreath upon his tomb. So forgotten were the Crusades by this time that Saladin's tomb had fallen into utter disrepair. Kaiser Wilhelm II had to personally commission it to be rebuilt before he could place his wreath upon it. The Crusades were so irrelevant to the Muslim world in 1898 that they had all but forgotten the tomb of their greatest hero from that era. Thomas Madden sums up the basic attitude towards the Crusades in the Muslim world between 1291 and very recently, saying, "The simple and startling fact is that the Crusades were virtually unknown in the Muslim world even a century ago. The term for the Crusades, Harb al-Salib, was only introduced into the Arab language in the mid-19th century. The first Arabic history of the Crusades was not written until 1899. It must be remembered that although the Crusades were of monumental importance to Europeans, they were a very minor, largely insignificant thing to the vast Muslim world. Traditionally, Muslims took very little interest in the people or events outside of the Dar al-Islam. There was, therefore, nothing to differentiate the Crusaders from any other of the numerous and nearly constant wars fought against infidels. The Crusades were, in any case, unsuccessful and thus irrelevant. A Western traveler in the 18th century would have been hard-pressed to find a Muslim in the Middle East who had heard of the Crusades. Even in the 19th century, they were known only to a handful of intellectuals. In the grand sweep of Islamic history, the Crusades simply did not matter. But then something happened. Recently, the Crusades were remembered by the Muslim world, or more precisely, a false memory of the Crusades was constructed by activists, which was then imposed upon the Muslim world, and then claimed to be a long-lasting memory, despite its very recent origins. But this false memory is not entirely the making of Muslims. In between 1291 and the present, the Crusades have also been reworked in the Western imagination as well. Crusading sentiment remained strong throughout Europe well after 1291, and throughout the remainder of the Middle Ages. But with the advent of the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment in Europe, perceptions about the Crusades began to shift. It is with these movements that many of the popular myths, which this video has been debunking, originated. Of course, the popular perception of the Crusades did not tank overnight. They continued to be romanticized by various authors throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. But the perception of them was decidedly more mixed after the Reformation and the Enlightenment. They were no longer seen as a univocal good. It was also during this time that many tried to associate them, often positively, with the modern notion of imperialism, despite, as we have seen, the glaring anachronisms involved in doing so. By the 20th century, imperialism was dying out. After World War II, popular opinion toward imperialism universally began to sour, and with this, so did popular opinions of the Crusades. The fullest expression of the negative 20th century opinion of the Crusades came to fruition in the immensely popular and influential work of the English writer Sir Stephen Runciman, who published a 3-volume history of the Crusades. The vast majority of contemporary misinformation regarding the Crusades owes directly or indirectly to the work of Stephen Runciman. Although his work has been heavily criticized by historians of the Crusades, it remains remarkably influential over the popular imagination. And it was from this well that the modern Muslim memory of the Crusades was born. The perspective and misinformation proffered by the likes of Runciman fed into a narrative that was advantageous to Muslim radicals, and it was for this reason that Muslims suddenly developed a very recent interest in the Crusades, or, more precisely, an interest in propagating a deeply flawed perception of them. As Hamad and Peters conclude, the United States was first included among the new Crusaders in some of the polemic of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt during the 1950s, and later in Libyan anti-American propaganda. Various movements of Arab nationalism vigorously promoted Arab identity and cohesion, not only writing histories in Arabic and emphasizing Arab preeminence in Islamic history, but also by asserting an Arabic popular resistance to the regimes of the Crusader states and the centrality of Egypt in that effort. They also claimed that Europeans had appropriated so much Arabic science and learning through the Crusades that the process led to the end of feudalism and hastened the arrival of the Renaissance and modernity, as well as later forms of European domination in the Islamic world. Such assertions put history to a strenuous test, one that forces it to fail. In short, the only reason for contemporary Muslim interest in the Crusades springs from the fact that, due to widespread negativity towards the Crusades in the West due to the work of the likes of Stephen Runciman, it is politically and ideologically advantageous for Muslim radicals to care about them. Medieval Muslims had only very limited interest in the Crusaders, and that limited interest further waned to near extinction almost immediately after the fall of Acre in 1291, only to be rekindled with a passion nearly 700 years later once popular opinion soured on the Crusades, and it began to be politically advantageous for Muslims to act as though they had been dealt some sort of deep grievance. Thomas Madden summarizes the situation well, saying, "For their part, medieval Muslims had no understanding or interest in the Crusades. The Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem was simply one more state in an already chaotic political landscape. When the Muslims of the region finally united, they dispatched the infidels, and that was all. They were a tiny crumb in the big soup of Islamic history. It is not the Crusades that led to the attacks of September 11th, but an artificial memory of the Crusades constructed by modern colonial powers and passed down by Arab nationalists and Islamists." The final myth that we shall consider regards the idea that the Crusades were fundamentally un-Christian, the idea that there is a performative contradiction between formally avowing the doctrines of Christianity while also taking up the sword in the name of holy war. The idea of killing in the name of God is, perhaps, the most enduring aspect of the Crusades in the modern imagination, as well as the most enduring source of criticism. Of course, Karen Armstrong is just chomping at the bit to make this point, saying, "Today, most of us would unhesitantly condemn the Crusades as wicked and unchristian. After all, Jesus had told his followers to love their enemies, not to exterminate them. He was a pacifist, and had more in common with Gandhi, perhaps, than Pope Urban. Now, my defense of the Crusades throughout this and subsequent videos will be taking for granted what is known as just war theory. My argument shall be that, to the extent that there is such a thing as a just war, the Crusades are a paradigm example. I cannot attempt a full defense of the theory here, but I will at least give a broad overview of what the theory asserts. This theory, at least within the Christian tradition, is typically attributed to St. Augustine. It has, of course, been developed and refined since Augustine's time, to the point that, in the present day, just war theory is better seen as a family of similar theories rather than a unified theory. I won't bore viewers with an examination of each variant of just war theory. For our purposes, it suffices to summarize the basic commitments that are common to all or most manifestations of the theory. Nicholas Phocion provides us with just such a summary as follows. Here, in summary form, are the 6 just war principles. Just cause. Imminent, present, and recent acts of aggression against one's own country or an ally count as good reasons for going to war. So do humanitarian catastrophes. Last resort. This principle slows down the process of going to war by asking the potential participants to make a series of efforts to avoid war. The intention of the principle is to retard the process of going to war so that, in some cases, war never breaks out. Proportionality. This is a benefits versus cost principle. Overall, it tells us that since war is such a horrible way to settle disputes, the potential participants to a war should estimate that, if successful, the benefits definitely outweigh the costs of going to war. Likelihood of success. This principle advises that a war should not be entered into if there is little or no chance that it will meet with some degree of success. Right intentions. Intentions should not be confused with motives. What is required is not that one's motives be pure or mostly good, but that the intentions to do something are right. Right intentions are, more often than not, tied to just cause. If a nation intends to act in order to correct an injustice, and does not act additionally in ways that lead to its own aggression or to exploitation, then it can be said to have right intentions. Legitimate authority. This is a public principle. It says that only those who are legally designated to make decisions about going or not going to war be permitted to do so. All others, if they trigger war by their actions, are acting unjustly. Arguments according to which there are no just wars, in other words, arguments for pacifism, are not something that I will be considering because they do not actually touch the case that I am making in this series. If one thinks that pacifism is correct, and that no one should ever engage in warfare for any reason whatsoever, then obviously it trivially follows from this that the Crusades were wrong. But notice that this is not a unique objection to the Crusades. This is an indictment of literally every culture and people group that has ever existed. In this series, I am concerned with the charge that there was something uniquely horrific or uniquely nefarious about the Crusades. I will be countering this charge by insisting that the Crusades, for the most part, meet the criteria of a just war, if such a thing exists. Establishing that there are such things as just wars in the first place is a project for another day. Those who contend that there is something uniquely nefarious about the Crusades, or the activities of the Crusaders, are generally either ignorant of the brutality of medieval warfare, or else they are cherry-picking the data. Medieval warfare was a vicious and brutal affair. There was no Geneva Convention or global human rights organization to dictate acceptable forms of warfare. So, a point that I will be returning to throughout this series is that it is very important that we are careful about imposing modern values and ideas onto medieval people when we evaluate their actions. Much ado has been made by critics of the Crusaders' actions, with no understanding that their actions typically reflected the norms of warfare for their day. This is not to say that extremely violent actions are okay just because they are socially acceptable, but it is to say that social expectations provide a mitigating factor which needs to be considered when assessing the actions of people from another time and place. As Steve Weidenkopf astutely reminds us, an authentic understanding of historical events begins not with the present time of the historical author, but with the contemporary time of the participant. Failure to adhere to that premise falsifies history and produces a reading into, rather than a learning from, historical events. Critics of the Crusades and the Church usually fall into the trap of believing that their own opinion or society is superior to those that came before them. With these tools firmly in hand, let us now squarely face the question of whether or not the very notion of holy war is incompatible with Christianity. Such criticisms, as we have seen, largely stem from the notion that Christianity is inherently pacifistic. But that is actually not a premise which the critic is entitled to take for granted. While there is a strong pacifist tradition within the Christian faith, especially prior to Constantine's rise to power, pacifism was not and never has been universally accepted by followers of Jesus Christ. There were controversies in early Christianity regarding Christians who were members of the Roman military, but these controversies regarded whether or not one could serve without worshipping the Roman gods. The disputes did not regard the idea of a Christian acting in a military capacity at all. Scripture itself is notoriously difficult to reconcile with pacifism, given the presence of direct commands from God to the nation of Israel to go to war with her enemies. Of course, Christians have a long history of wrestling with these sorts of passages and how precisely they should be understood and applied in the New Testament age, but few have been willing to simply disregard them altogether. Indeed, it was precisely because of the need to arrive at a cohesive understanding of these matters that drove St. Augustine to develop just war theory in the first place. By the time of the First Crusade, just war theory was already well established and widely accepted within the Christian world. As Thomas Asbridge points out, turning bloodshed into a sacred act required the Pope to reconcile Christian teaching with the ruthlessness of medieval warfare. With the preaching of the First Crusade, the Latin Church went far beyond simply condoning violence. It energetically encouraged military conflict and promoted carnage as an expression of pious devotion. This sanctification of warfare, in which two seemingly immiscible elements, violence and Christianity, were fused, now stands as the defining characteristic of the First Crusade, the feature which has capitulated this expedition into the popular imagination and aroused generations of scholarly attention. In fact, the First Crusade was not utterly abnormal, but an extreme product of concerns common to all ages of human society: the need to contain mankind's innate appetite for violence and the desire to distinguish between good and evil warfare. Even modern societies posit a moral distinction between private murder and killing performed in the midst of sanctioned public warfare. In spite of its stated ban on bloodshed, Mosaic law actually endorsed military defense in the face of aggression. Elsewhere, the Old Testament went even further. Being an ongoing history of the Hebrews' long struggle for survival, it describes a series of holy wars, conflicts, sanctioned and supported by divine license, in which God was held to be the author of victory. To patristic theologians, these examples appeared to indicate that, under the right circumstances, even vengeful or aggressive warfare might be permissible. Even the New Testament, if judged from a certain perspective, could appear to be ambivalent in its approach to physical conflict. Jesus had, after all, said that he came to bring not peace but a sword, and at one point had used a whip of cords to drive moneylenders out of the temple. John France adds, "This has been a cause of great difficulty for modern writers looking back at this period. It has seemed to them a terrible paradox that the Pope, servant of the Prince of Peace, should inaugurate a remorselessly violent movement. But this is to impose modern perceptions on medieval Christianity. The Bible offers no definition of the Christian attitude towards war. The words of Christ himself are ambivalent. He claimed, 'I came not to send a peace, but a sword.' The ethic of love thy neighbor was certainly important, but the new religion adopted as authoritative not only the books of the New Testament, but also those of the Old Testament, in which vendetta, feud, war, and conquest, all in the name of the Lord, appear with great frequency." The response here from many will undoubtedly be that the Ten Commandments are unambiguous. The sixth commandment says in no uncertain terms, "Thou shalt not kill." Surely this straightforwardly precludes any sort of warfare. However, the Hebrew word translated as kill here is ratzak, and the primary definition of the word is premeditated murder or assassination. In other words, the sixth commandment constitutes a prohibition against unlawful killing, but not against killing under any circumstances. And this is made clear by the fact that elsewhere, the Old Testament law explicitly commands the death penalty for various crimes, meaning that, unless one believes that the Pentateuch straightforwardly contradicts itself, the sixth commandment must exclusively prohibit murder. As Arthur Holmes says, the first biblical datum to consider is the sixth commandment, but by itself it does not help us sort through the complexity of the war issue. The Decalogue consists of general rules that are applied in their larger biblical context to concrete situations. In the Mosaic Law as a whole, capital punishment was allowable for at least 10 different crimes, and killing in self-defense was not a criminal offense. "Thou shalt not kill" cannot, therefore, be taken to rule out all killing, let alone war. The New Testament is less direct than the Old Testament in its teaching about whether or not killing in the context of warfare is ever permissible. This is primarily because it is concerned with the behavior of individuals in churches rather than matters of state or government. Jesus never really addresses the matter. However, Paul makes some comments in Romans 13 that warrant consideration. In the opening of the chapter we read, "Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a servant of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a servant of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." So while Paul does not directly address the issue of armed combat here, he does essentially say that governments have the right from God to punish those who do evil deeds, and his language of not bearing the sword in vain seems to indicate that God has given governments the right to use lethal force if necessary. Again, Holmes's comments are correct when he says, the key passage is Romans 13, 1-7. Here, the right to use arms is accorded to civil authorities inasmuch as they are divinely commissioned to restrain and punish evildoers. The passage pertains directly to matters of criminal justice and civil order, and only by extrapolation to international conflict. But it does make clear that for some purposes, the precise scope of which is not defined, government has the right to use lethal force. So to sum up this section, I have sketched the broad contours of just war theory and emphasized that my argument throughout this series will be that the Crusades, for the most part, constitute examples of just wars. I have pointed out that the idea that the Crusades were unchristian is typically predicated upon the unargued assumption that Christianity is an inherently pacifistic religion, and I have suggested that this assumption is false, based on teachings in both the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. This video has tackled 5 prominent myths about the Crusades. We have seen that, contrary to popular belief, the Crusades were not an unprovoked invasion of the Middle East, but rather a reaction to 400 years of aggressive Islamic conquest of Christian lands. I have addressed the prominent idea that the Crusades involved forcibly converting Muslims to Christianity. I showed that this is obviously not true of the Crusades in the Holy Land, and while there was an evangelistic component to the Northern Crusades, I have suggested that even here there are important nuances to consider. I have also considered and rather harshly criticized the idea that the Crusaders were motivated primarily by greed, or that their activities can be considered early attempts at European colonialism. I have further addressed the claim that the Crusades were the cause of 9/11, or the contemporary unrest in the Middle East, and explained why history indicates that the Crusades actually didn't make a big splash in the Muslim world, being largely forgotten soon after 1291 until quite recently. Lastly, I have defended the idea that the Crusades constitute an example of a just war, thereby undercutting the criticism that they were fundamentally unchristian in nature. My hope has been that debunking of these myths serves to remove roadblocks to a more sympathetic examination of the Crusades, and also serves as an appetizer for a more in-depth critique of myths about the Crusades, as I attempt to offer viewers a more accurate understanding of the history. That is what viewers can expect in the remaining videos of this series. My aim is not to sugarcoat the Crusades, or to whitewash the darker chapters of this saga. Fundamentally, my aim is to give viewers an accurate understanding of and deeper appreciation for the history.